promises anywhere between $3,000 and $5,000 for every real American family. They get that for nothing, like that basic income, right? Upon moving into the White House, Windrum immediately declares Congress an advisory body, strips it of all of its power. And when members of Congress resist, he locks them up without the slightest semblance of due process. So it's the beginning of the end for the American democracy. Now, the rest of the book describes one long, disorienting nightmare of a national descent into martial law, torture chambers, and concentration camps. And the camps are established to basically incarcerate and re-educate people to accept the new order in America. Once again, the idea that if you don't accept the fascist rule, you will be rounded up and you will either be tortured, killed, or you will be basically re-educated. And what got me into this mode of thinking was today I was listening to CNN, and they were talking about how much they hated Trump, and they gave the death tolls, and they were accusing Trump of killing all these people, and it was just basically going overboard. And then Brian Stelter made a comment about supply and demand of this parallel universe world that many of you who listen to this program are living in. That Trump's still president, that Joe Biden didn't win, and that we're providing, that somebody's providing the supply and demand for all of this nonsense, all of this lie, all of this disinformation. Here's what Brian Stelter had to say when he was on CNN.
I think we should be honest about America's supply and demand problem. And our democracy is in a perilous place right now. The 2020 election is over, even though President Trump is still in denial about that. His claims of voter fraud are withdrawn. Thus, reliable news sources are mostly moving on to cover President-elect Biden, to cover the transition instead. But there is an entire constellation of websites and talk shows that are in denial, just like Trump. They are supplying disinformation about the election results. And wherever there's a huge supply, there is a high demand. These crowds in Washington over the weekend prove the point. These crowds are being deceived about the election. But there's demand for it. There's demand for a fictional universe. You know what? I don't want to call it an alternative reality anymore, because it is not reality. There's nothing real about this. But in this fictional parallel universe, the election was rigged. It was stolen out from under Trump, and Trump was the rightful leader. This is the new organism. We are going to be reckoning with the consequences of these lies for years. Now, I don't know what you thought after the election. I kind of thought this stuff would start to subside by now, nearly 2 weeks after election day. But think again, it is actually getting worse. These made-up stories and claims about voting machines and other fraud, they are airing all across Fox and other parts of the right-wing media world. Trump lawyers like Rudy Giuliani are being given free rein and lots of airtime to spread these lies to millions of people. Those lawyers are losing in the courts. So instead, they're fighting in the court of public opinion. They're fighting on Twitter, they're fighting on Fox, and on channels even further to the right from Fox. And there is a great, terrible supply of this content. That's true, but it is time to wrestle with the demand problem. Supply and demand. Now, to be sure, take a page from Economics 101, supply sometimes creates demand, and social media algorithms sure do fuel it. But as Jay Rosen said right there, the demand is an important part of this story. There are lies about voter fraud all across social media these days. These lies would not be nearly as popular if there were no demand for it. These marches that Sarah Seidler was at yesterday, they would not be attracting thousands of people if there was no demand for this parallel universe. It's the result of a poisonous stew of social alienation, negative partisanship, severe distrust of news sources, and I'm sure there are other factors as well. Look, the Trump supporters in my life, the people who voted for him 2 weeks ago, they don't believe the election was rigged. They're moving on. Most people are moving on. Most Trump voters do not buy all the baloney that's being sold by Rudy and by Trump and by these others.
Why is there a demand? You need to ask yourself, why is there a demand? There's a demand because the media is not doing its job. And the fact that there is no civic education and no real journalism. Because according to the book, It Can Happen Here, Sinclair Lewis makes an argument for civic education. He also makes an argument that journalism is a basic pillar of democracy. And he said many Americans lack civic education. And many Americans can't be objective regardless of their convictions. So people in an echo chamber and not allowing them to think openly makes them easily exploitable. I mean, we've learned about several dystopian ends in books like 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World, and how they paint a bleak picture of totalitarian control that is intolerant of freedom and expression. In 1984, Orwell gave us a perfect rendering of a totalitarian state and how they used violence and language to keep the people enslaved. However, quite contrary to the spirit and intention of its author, the book has been transformed by Americans into something worse than a metaphor, a cliche which is our thinking for us whenever we struggle to understand something not desirable in our politics. The statement, though, that Trump is a fascist or Orwellian pins the problem on one man when basically the fascist evolution has been taking place for decades. In fact, beyond the fascist definitions provided by those who don't know history are the more appropriate definitions of despotism and pathocracy, whereas 1984 was a dystopia built on the subjugation of a boot eternally stomping on the human face forever. The Brave New World by Huxley was a dystopia built on the idea of people that are too drugged and entertained to tell that they're living a lie. See, the masses were more or less endlessly drugged and entertained, and so their opinions never had a chance to develop or impaired, or at birth they were basically being programmed, so they never really thought of the tyranny. And so the tyranny in Brave New World was the tyranny of a vapid public who never thought beyond the most recent mindlessness and whatever the next sexual encounter they have. It was very vapid and stale, and so there's so much familiarity in a lot of the books I'm mentioning tonight because they are simply portents to human behavior and how absolute power corrupts absolutely. Expressing one's disdain for the way the media handles an election, or perhaps theorizing that perhaps we're seeing an election fraud, or that COVID-19, the pandemic, is being exploited politically, is now being condemned by an overzealous media that has more times than not called itself the resistance. I mean, we best be asking ourselves, what is it that they wish to resist, and what lengths are they willing to go to further their agendas? Could they lie in order to harden the resolve that the end basically justifies the means? I mean, how many times do we lie to ourselves because of our partisanship affiliation? It is happening more now than before, and the frightening part is people believe the lies they tell themselves about what they think their choices and political preferences are, or what these choices and political preferences will give them eventually. I mean, subtlety has been part of the success of